You're listening to Formosa Files. I'm Eric Michael Smith.
I'm John Ross.
Okay, people, picture this scene. You're on the southwest coast of Taiwan, near modern-day Tainan. It's the morning of April 30th, 1661, right, John? 1661.
Mm-hmm.
Looking westward out towards the sea, from the haze of fog, materializes what can only be described as an armada. Hundreds of Chinese war junks and transport ships carrying about 25,000 men. Taiwan is about to be invaded. This massive invasion force is led by Zheng Chenggong, and we know him in the West better as Koxinga.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation. Formosa Files.
He was the leader of a large maritime network of trade centered in Fujian, but more importantly, he was a diehard Ming loyalist looking for a refuge to resist or even overthrow the Qing dynasty.
Yeah, imagine that sight. You're looking out, a forest of sails and masts and banners. Terrifying. And one of the biggest turning points in the history of Taiwan.
So the date, April 30th, was it specifically significant to Koxinga?
Yes, it was significant. He's waiting for a high tide. He wants an especially high tide to get his ships through a shallow and narrow gap. There are two entrances into the bay of Tainan area. One is next to the Fort Zeelandia, that's covered, and there's another smaller one, and with this high tide, he could get through there into the bay. But more than that, April is a great time for an amphibious landing, for getting your troops across the strait. The water is less rough.
Right. Fort Zeelandia is the headquarters of the Dutch that are on Taiwan, and Zheng Chenggong, or Koxinga, is invading Taiwan from China with the hope of evicting the Dutch and using Taiwan as a base. But it's never been all that easy to sail from China and invade Taiwan. And if you read like modern scholars who have written about possible future invasions of Taiwan, they also note that window that you were just describing is very short. Like you really only have late April and into early May for being able to get across the strait. Other times are just too rough.
Yes, that's right. And there's another reason why Koxinga chose late April. He was waiting for the turn of the monsoons. There's a very important wind shift in this part of the world.
Okay. So we're talking about that northeast monsoon from October to March. And that for people who live in Taipei, they probably know those months as among the most miserable out of the year.
Think of winter, the wind from the north, summer, wind from the south. Now, Koxinga is not thinking about how rough the waters are. He's thinking about Fort Zeelandia cannot send a ship south for help because the ship will be going against the wind.
Right. So, and the only way to call for help is to send a ship. You can't make a phone call.
Yeah, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company's headquarters is down in Java in modern-day Indonesia, due south.
He seems to have been quite a clever commander. Going back to that landing, we've got all these ships that suddenly appear out of nowhere. So the Dutch were taken by surprise?
They had thought an invasion was coming, but they didn't know the specific timing of it.
As I remember the story, he lands a little bit to the north and is able to get his troops off the ships. What's the reaction from the locals? Obviously, the Dutch are getting ready for what's coming, but what about the local people? What do they think of the Chinese?
Well, there are basically two local groups. The Chinese settlers, they welcome him as a liberator. They help him land. The Aborigines are cautious, but they'll soon come over to Koxinga's side. They didn't really have much choice, especially the Aborigines in the immediate area. The ones further afield would resist, and resist quite effectively as well.
So the Chinese and the very local Aboriginal people that were living in that area, they see this powerful arrival and they're thinking, these guys have a strong chance of being the next leaders.
Yes, it's a domino effect. Once your rival Aboriginal tribes ships have gone over, you better go over as well. Because you'll not just be facing a huge Chinese force, but you'll be dealing with your rivals.
But, with any amphibious landing, right? Think about Normandy, or both sides know that it's those early moments that are important. If you get a foothold on the beach, you've got a good chance of success. But on the other side, if you can keep them just off the coast, right? So what did the Dutch do to prevent them from landing?
Well, it was a bit too late. It was so quick, but they did send a force right away to try and displace them from an island just north of Fort Zeelandia. They put 240 men on this island, and they attacked an advance party of Koxinga's men, about 4,000, I think.
Wait. 240 European Dutch people against 4,000 Chinese troops?
Yeah, and the Dutch were really arrogant going into it. They said they'll run at the smell of gunpowder.
Right, yeah.
They were thinking of fighting peasants.
Right, so significantly underestimating the army that was coming at them.
Yes, incredible discipline too. So the Dutch fire their muskets, men drop, but the formation doesn't bend, doesn't run. They dispatch arrows. The sky turns dark with arrows. They say the Dutch run. They're in full panic. Half of them are killed. Only half make it back to
I'm
Fort
surprised
Zeelandia.
it was only half. I think it's probably fair to say that one of the reasons they were so arrogant or underestimating was because just like 9-10 years earlier, they had a encounter with Chinese rebels on Taiwan who had fought them essentially with farm tools and had been beaten rather easily.
Yeah, they put down an equally large force of farmers who were revolting, and they thought it would be a repeat. But no, they're dealing with battle-hardened soldiers who had a really, really strict commander who would execute his men if they failed.
Right. Cowardice is not an option. But what about the naval side? Was there any battles between Chinese and Dutch ships?
The Dutch had 3 ships, as I recall, and they sent these out right away. They engaged some junks. There were hundreds of them around the area, so vastly outnumbered. But the Dutch ships were superior. They were heavily armed, lots of cannon. It's not to the Dutch advantage because this is shallow water. Their main ship explodes, a ship called the Hector. Have you ever read the Iliad?
No, I can't say that I have, but I have seen the movie.
Seen the movie, okay.
The movie Hector, Troy with Brad Pitt, yeah.
Hector is not a good name for a siege, is it?
No, he is killed by Achilles quite mercilessly in the story.
Yeah. Okay, so this Hector, the ship, explodes, not by anything the Chinese did, but the cannon on the ship set off the gunpowder stored on the ship. Massive explosion, 1 survivor. The other 2 ships leave. They go for deeper waters. The 2 captains disagree about what to do next. One favored staying in the area. He could alert any possible Dutch ships going through the strait. Another captain of a smaller ship called the Maria, he was determined to try to alert Batavia, but he's going to have to take a new route because of the winds.
So the Maria, we'll talk about the Maria later, but the captain of that one, the ship called the Maria, he decides the smart thing to do would be to go and get reinforcements because they are vastly outnumbered. Okay, so the forces of Koxinga have landed. They're securing the area, and they first lay siege to a smaller fort.
Yes, there's a small fort called Fort Provincia. This was built in response to the Chinese uprising 9 years earlier. It's strong enough to defend against farmers, but not real soldiers. So it's a minor fort, and they surrendered pretty much straight away.
So after this, it's all focus on Fort Zeelandia, the main base of the Dutch in Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
And so they start sending back and forth communication. And an interesting part of this story is they capture a Dutch priest. I can't pronounce his name clearly. Antonius Hambroek, perhaps.
Hambroek, yeah.
And he becomes like the go-between between Koxinga and the people over on Fort Zeelandia. So Koxinga tells this Dutch priest that he needs to go over to Fort Zeelandia and convince them to surrender immediately. And if he comes back with any other answer, he's going to be executed.
Yes, Koxinga has already had a few letters going back and forth. He's getting frustrated. It seems obvious that the Dutch should surrender with his generous terms. They can take all their goods, their cash, and leave. The situation's hopeless. So Koxinga feels frustrated. That's why he sends this Reverend Hambroek
But instead of telling them to surrender, he basically says, "Go with God, my compatriots, and we will fight to the death." He does the opposite of what he's been told to do.
A brave man, yeah. I mean, he could have stayed at Fort Zeelandia to save himself, but...
So he goes back over to Koxinga and says, "No, we're not surrendering. And in fact, I didn't say what you said." And Koxinga makes good on his pledge, and this brave individual is executed.
Yes, the sad part, well, on top of his death, is that his teenager daughter became Koxinga's concubine.
That was one of the consequences of war back then.
Yes. So Koxinga is outraged. He launches a bombardment of Fort Zeelandia. And now it's his turn to fail, to be overconfident. The Dutch make short work of the cannons. They're not placed that well. And returning fire from Fort Zeelandia kills a lot of his men, takes out a lot of cannon. Fort Zeelandia was a beautiful design, as European forts were at that time. They had mini forts that protrude from the fort itself. And they enable you to have tremendous covering fire and to concentrate from various angles on a point. Devastating if you're not familiar with.
And yeah, Europeans have been playing with cannons longer than the Chinese.
Europe had been in a state of war for a long time, and they'd had a lot of practice. The Chinese cannons were actually quite good, but the Dutch fortifications were better, and also their use of cannons.
So Koxinga, after this little bit of getting blasted by the Dutch, he does what any sensible commander would do: settle down, surround, wait them out.
Yes, that's especially important for him because he's desperately short of food. There's not much food to be had in the area. He didn't bring any over. It's not harvest season. And even when the harvest is ready, there won't be enough.
That's interesting. You would have thought that the invaders would have access to the whole island so they could find food somewhere. But he's actually concerned that he'll have trouble feeding his army.
Yeah, I mean, think of the numbers he brought over. On that first day, there were 25,000 men, but there were also more that came. So you're looking at well over 30,000 people in an area. You've just doubled the region's population.
A couple days and there's nothing left. It has all been devoured. But of course, the situation is even more dire inside the fort where nothing can come in or out.
Well, yes, they do have supplies, though.
They've been stocking up.
Yes.
Smart move. Okay, so this is progressing over about a month. They're sitting there trying to see when or if the Dutch will see the writing on the wall and surrender. But maybe we should go ahead and rewind just a little bit and briefly explain why Koxinga is even coming to Taiwan. What's the impetus for him showing up in the first place?
Well, if we go all the way back, it's quite convenient. The year 1624, that's the year the Dutch settled in what is today Tainan.
Right.
And it's also the year Koxinga was born. Born in Japan, in the trading port city of Nagasaki, to a Japanese mother and to a Chinese pirate warlord. Now, he grew up during a time of turmoil when the Ming dynasty was failing, soon to be taken over by the Qing dynasty. And unlike his father, who went over to the Qing, decided to fight. So he's been fighting the Qing as they advance south through China.
And the important thing to remember about the Qing is that they are not Han Chinese. They're Manchus. They're from the northeast part of China. And they are foreigners. And they require you to do things like shave your forehead and grow that pigtail or queue. So Koxinga, according to reports, was of rather unusual intelligence and energy, and he became a commander at the age of just 22. Very impressive. And where does he get this westernized name of Koxinga from?
So his Chinese name is Zheng Chenggong.
Right.
His family name is Zheng. He was, because of his loyalty, given the family name of the Ming dynasty, Zhu. But this was too sacred to be spoken aloud. So he was called Guóxìngyé. It means Lord of the Imperial Surname. Koxinga is a westernized form of Guóxìngyé.
So you mentioned earlier that his father went over to the Qing and surrendered.
Yes. So some of the forces are going over. Some of the forces remain under the son's, Koxinga's command. So he fights on with great success, actually.
So he's fighting his own father.
His father was kept out of action, sort of under house arrest. But yeah, he's on different sides from his father. Basically, he's fighting a losing game. He's forced to retire to the southern coastal area, Fujian. He's looking for a new place to move to.
When you've been shoved all the way to the coast of Fujian, you really don't have very many more options. He needs a new base. So why did he pick Taiwan over perhaps Hainan Island or Penghu or something like that?
Well, he had some knowledge of Taiwan. His family, the Zheng family trading empire, had dealings with the Dutch, and they knew Taiwan. But I think a lot of the impetus came from someone called He Tingbing. He was a translator for the Dutch. He was a middleman between the Dutch and Koxinga.
This guy is famous for basically playing both sides off of each other and for milking both sides for everything that he could get.
Yes, that's right. Incredibly greedy. So there was some difficulty between Koxinga and the Dutch, and he's telling Koxinga, yeah, the Dutch, they're going to send you tribute. They recognize your sovereignty over the area. And then heading back to the Dutch and saying, oh, yeah, I've smoothed everything over. Trade's going to go back to normal.
But I guess the most important part of this story is that He Tingbing was the person who encouraged Koxinga to take Taiwan, to pick Taiwan as the new base, telling Koxinga that Taiwan was a great fertile land, it's poorly defended, it'll be a cakewalk, just sail your ships over there.
Koxinga's commanders were against the idea. It's a malarial wilderness, too wild, can't support a large army.
And then also you have to think about their mission was to come back and liberate China, right? So it's a bit of a ways back and forth between those two. Not perhaps the location that most military commanders would pick for coming back.
Yes, it would psychologically represent a surrender, a failure. They'd be leaving China to go overseas.
Right.
But Koxinga's made up his mind.
So the Dutch, they must have been able to get some intelligence, either through spies or somehow from the other side. So they must have gotten a sort of heads up that there was an invasion coming.
They thought an invasion was coming, and they prepared for it. Actually, if Koxinga had come a year earlier, they might have been better prepared.
So who was in charge of the Dutch presence at the time?
A Swedish man called Frederick Koyet. He'd become governor of Taiwan in 1656. Koyet.
Did he take the threat seriously? You said they were preparing, but what did they actually do to prepare?
If you recall, Koxinga comes over at 61, right?
Right.
But in early 1660, there are rumors of an imminent invasion. The Chinese settlers on Taiwan believed it, and they were moving their goods, moving people, moving money back to China. And they got some credible warnings. The Dutch took it seriously, so much so that Koyet and the other leaders, Formosan Council, they started to prepare, strengthen defenses. They dispatched a ship to the VOC headquarters in Batavia asking for help. And the VOC in Batavia, they acted quickly, and they sent a fleet of, I think it was 12 ships under a commander called Jan van der Laan. But he's got ambiguous orders, really. Dual-purpose mission. Protect Taiwan from any possible invasion from Koxinga, and failing that threat, try and take Macau from the Portuguese.
Defend Taiwan or take Macau.
Yes. Van der Laan arrived in Anping at late July, and he stays there for 2.5 months. And he's very impatient. He doesn't get on with Koyet. He was sure that the rumors of an invasion were idle gossip, he said. And he wanted to attack Macau. But the Dutch leaders on Formosa, Koyet and the others, they were adamant that Van der Laan should stay. He could attack Macau the following year. Van der Laan threw a tantrum. He was furious. He returned to Batavia, taking some ships and men. Other ships would leave too. So there were just 3 ships when Koxinga did arrive.
Oh, so this Van der Laan guy gets back to modern day Indonesia, and he hasn't fulfilled either of his missions. He hasn't captured Macau or defended Taiwan. So he's probably going to get not treated very well by his superiors.
Okay, so he had to spin it. He's reporting to the superiors in Batavia, criticizing criticizes Koyet, just incredibly harsh assessment of Koyet. He mocked the invasion threat, said it was just gossip. And he said the reason the Chinese settlers were leaving was because Koyet and the other top leaders persecuted the Chinese.
So the headquarters back in modern day Indonesia, they wouldn't have any reason not necessarily to believe van der Laan. They probably bought his story.
Yes, well, Koyet had other enemies in Batavia, so they were quite happy with this assessment. Koyet was fired, and he was to return to Batavia immediately and answer for his failings. So they got a replacement. This would-be governor Klenk sailed for Formosa as Koyet's replacement. And he carried papers of dismissal for Koyet and a letter to be given to Koxinga apologizing for Koyet's behavior. So Klenk set sail in late June.
This is hilarious. So June 1661, You've got Klenk on a ship sailing towards Taiwan with letters apologizing to Koxinga, firing Koyet, and he has no idea that Koxinga has already been on Taiwan for quite a period of time and that Zealandia is under siege.
Incredible, isn't it? Yeah, so imagine the emotions in Taiwan, Fort Zealandia. They see a ship. Wow. Koyet raises a red flag and fired warning shots to alert the captain it's not safe to come in. But Koyet sends a sampan out to meet the ship. And he's thinking, is this the first of a fleet?
I'm saved. Yeah, I'm being relieved.
No, bad news. They
You're
haven't
fired.
heard about Koxinga. And there's a letter of dismissal, which was really hyperbolic. Here's a line from it. You are weak-hearted and lacking in the spirit of bravery that should distinguish one occupying your position. And, there's a lot of this.
But it wouldn't take long for Klenk, or this would-be Governor Klenk, to have the tables turned and feel like a bit of an idiot because he's showing up to be the new governor and he didn't even know that the place that he's going to be the governor of is under siege and not doing well.
Yeah, despite Koyet's invitations, Klenk didn't even set foot on the island. He sailed away to Japan.
What a loser. He didn't even try to help.
Yeah.
But what about that ship, the Maria, we talked about earlier? It was trying to make its way down to Batavia to tell them they needed help, but it needed to find a new way. Did they make it?
Yeah, so soon after this devastating false hope, a relief fleet of 10 ships with soldiers, alcohol, and meat did arrive.
Gotta have your alcohol for any siege.
The Maria had made it. But this life and death siege stuff is a real roller coaster of emotions. The relief fleet arrives, but the weather is too bad. The ships cannot land their men and goods. They sail away. Typhoon weather. The ships leave. They sail around Penghu. This fleet do come back in 3 weeks. They've lost an element of surprise, but the people besieged in Fort Zealandia are happy to see them.
Okay, so to recap real quick, one ship does show up with a new governor. They're going to fire the Koyet governor, and they're going to apologize to Koxinga. But that captain doesn't stop. He sails off towards Japan. But some ships managed to come up because that Maria ship had made it. But more sadness, they're not able to land completely. So at this point, the Dutch, do they have any hope?
They have hope after the fleet comes back and they're able to land the goods and the men. They get 700 soldiers, reinforcements, not bad. That's doubling the number of fighting men. They have supplies. They have these ships. And Koxinga is still struggling to feed his men.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an aspect that I hadn't considered before. So, I always thought about the Dutch sitting in there being hungry, but there's many more men outside the walls.
At this time, August, September, there are actually people outside Fort Zealandia, Chinese, defecting, sneaking into the fort, risking their lives to get into a besieged fort. That tells you how hungry they were.
So it would be awesome if we could finish the story today in this episode, but we can't. We can't go any longer, so we're going to have to tell you how it all ended next time around. We're going to have a defector, traitor, if you like, and we will find out what happens to all of these people, Koyet, Koxinga, Zealandia, and Taiwan.
Yes. Before we leave, I just want to recommend Tonio Andrade's books on Taiwan. He's done 3. The one related to the siege, Lost Colony. It's one of the best books on Taiwan history.
Awesome. You've been listening to Formosa Files. I'm Eric Michael Smith.
I'm John Ross.
Do join us again for the closing chapter on the siege of Fort Zealandia next time.
Happy reading.